Hey there folks, welcome to Dark Ascent. Today, I'll be showing you some of the stupidest ways to die while climbing the world's highest mountains. From the Dhaulagiri climb where two nerds were headed straight into their doom, and these Sherpas saw it coming right from the start, to an Everest expedition where a content creator trusted a digital system to help guide decisions deep into the death zone. It was May 20th, 2017, and the wind across the south col of Mount Everest was already tearing at the tents pitched at 26,000 feet. The south col is the last camp before the summit, a barren saddle of ice and loose rock sitting right at the edge of what climbers call the death zone. The altitude above 26,000 feet, where there is so little oxygen that the human body is quite literally dying the whole time it is up there. Nothing heals at that height, nothing recovers, and every hour spent that high is borrowed against a clock that only ever resets by going down. Above the col stands the final 3,000 feet of the mountain, a steep ramp of snow and ice and rock that climbers move up through the night so they can reach the top in the morning and, if everything goes right, be back down before the afternoon weather rolls in. Almost nobody up there is climbing without bottled oxygen, and almost nobody is climbing without the Sherpa teams who fix the ropes, carry the loads, manage the gas, and quietly make the whole thing survivable for paying clients who could never do it alone. Tate and Sloan Whitlock had paid a great deal of money to be standing on that col. They were 43 and 41 from Scottsdale, Arizona, a married couple who had built a comfortable, photogenic life and a real following around it. He had made his money in medical device sales and carried himself like a man who had never lost an argument he could afford to win. She ran their lifestyle brand, the trips, the gear, the carefully lit mornings, and had turned the two of them into the kind of couple other people screenshot and envy. Everest was supposed to be the crown on all of it, the highest, the hardest, the one that would make every other post they had ever made look small. The thing you have to understand about them is that they did not see this climb the way a real mountaineer sees it, as something earned slowly over years of smaller peaks and a whole lot of humility. They saw it as a thing they had purchased, like a first-class seat or a table that should have been ready and waiting the moment they walked in. And in their world, when you pay enough for something, the people around it exist to make it go smoothly, not to ever tell you no. I've watched people treat a summit like a product they ordered online, and it never once goes the way they think it will. They had been collecting summits for a few years, the way certain people collect them, with heavy guiding and fixed ropes and a team of professionals doing the genuinely dangerous work, while the client simply walks the route between them. There's nothing wrong with that on its own. Plenty of good, humble people climb exactly that way and treat the staff around them like the experts they are. The Whitlocks did not. They had shown up at base camp already, certain they knew enough, complaining about the food, complaining about the pace of the acclimatization rotations, and sitting through the safety briefings like people enduring a fire drill rather than absorbing information that might one day keep them alive. The hardest thing for a certain kind of wealthy client to accept about a mountain like this is that it is the one room they will ever walk into where their money buys them almost nothing that matters. It can buy the permit, the tents, the oxygen, and the finest guides on Earth. It cannot buy a body that has acclimatized. It cannot buy the judgment that comes from years of smaller climbs. And it absolutely cannot buy the humility to do what a more experienced person tells you when your own life is on the line. Everything the Whitlocks had ever used to get everything they wanted was useless above 26,000 feet, and they had no idea because nothing in their lives had ever once required them to find out. I want to be careful. Plenty of paying clients are humble and kind, but these two had decided the mountain owed them a summit. The man assigned to lead them to the top was named Pemba Rinzin. He was 39, born in a village in the Khumbu Valley, in the shadow of the same peaks he now climbed for a living, and he had stood on the summit of Everest 11 separate times. He had been turned back by weather. He had carried sick climbers down on his own back. He had watched people die up high, and he had a quiet, exact way of reading the mountain and the sky that came from a lifetime of paying very close attention to both. By any honest measure, he was one of the most qualified human beings on the entire mountain that season. Pemba did not climb for the glory of it, the way the clients often imagined. He climbed because it was the best work available to a man from his valley, work that paid for his daughter's schooling down in Kathmandu, and kept the roof on his parents' house in the Khumbu, and he was very good at it. Good in the patient, unshowy way of a person whose entire job is to bring other people home alive. He had a wife and 2 girls who watched the weather reports during the climbing season, the way the families of fishermen watch the sea. Everything careful about him, every slow step and rationed breath and nervous glance at the sky came from the simple fact that he fully intended to see them again. And the Whitlocks treated him like the help. They never quite learned his name, called him by 2 or 3 wrong ones across the whole expedition, and never once corrected themselves. And whenever he spoke, careful and accented and precise, they would share a little look with each other, the kind of look that says, "Isn't this quaint?" as if his caution were a charming local custom and not the single most valuable thing on the mountain. It turns my stomach that they couldn't be bothered to learn the name of the one man who could keep them breathing up there. Pemba had led clients like this before, and he had a way of working with them that did not depend on them respecting him at all. He simply did his job, watched them closely, and kept his own counsel. He knew that the things which actually mattered up high were not opinions. They were facts. The rate the oxygen burned, the speed the weather built, the hour showing on the clock. And he intended to manage every one of them, whether the Whitlocks appreciated it or not. On the afternoon of May 20th, they rested at the South Col as well as anyone can rest at that altitude, and a little before 10 that night, into a hard cold wind and a sky scattered with stars, they clipped into the fixed line and started up. It had been like that the whole way up the mountain. On the lower slopes, weeks earlier, Pemba and the other Sherpas had done the heaviest and most dangerous work of the entire expedition, ferrying loads through the icefall in the small hours when the ice is most stable, fixing and checking the ropes, building the camps, doing the quiet, invisible labor that turns a deadly mountain into something a paying client can survive. The Whitlocks had walked through all of it as though it were a hotel that had simply assembled itself around them. When Pemba had once gently slowed Tate on a steep section to fix his footing, Tate had shrugged him off and complained to the operator that his guide was treating him like a beginner. They had come to be served, and a man trying to keep them alive kept getting in the way of the experience they had paid for. The climb out of the South Col in the dark is its own strange world. Everything shrinks to the small circle of a headlamp and the boots of the person ahead. The cold finds every gap in your clothing and settles into your bones with the wind pushing it well past 40 degrees below zero, and the only sounds are the crampons biting the ice, the hiss of the oxygen, and your own breath loud inside the mask. Pemba set a pace that felt, to the Whitlocks, insultingly slow. It was not slow. It was the exact pace the math of the night demanded, the pace that would get them to the top with enough oxygen left in the bottles to also get them back down, which is the only part of any summit that has ever really mattered. I admire that his slow pace was really survival math, the exact speed that gets a body home, and they read it as weakness. Here's the thing about bottled oxygen that the Whitlocks never once bothered to understand. You do not carry enough of it to breathe freely and easily. You carry a careful, rationed amount set to a low flow and calculated to last the entire long round trip, up and back down. And the single fastest way to die high on that mountain is to burn through it before you are safely down. Pemba had set their regulators to a conservative flow and told them, as plainly as he could, to leave them exactly there. For the first couple of hours they did, but they were cold and they were working hard, and the low flow made them feel weak and slow. And somewhere on the dark slope below the balcony, out of his sight, first Tate and then Sloan reached down and quietly turned their own regulators up. It felt wonderful. The extra oxygen flooded in, the strength came back into their legs, and suddenly the careful pace felt ridiculous to them. An old man dawdling on an easy hill, and they began to push, surging ahead on the fixed line, pleased with themselves, more certain than ever that they had been right all along about how easy this really was. Strung out above and below them on the dark slope were the headlamps of the other climbers and their Sherpas, a thin line of small lights crawling up the side of the mountain, every one of them running the same desperate clock. Up there the body is starving for oxygen, no matter what the bottle gives it. The brain is slower, the hands are clumsier, and the simplest tasks, clipping a carabiner or swapping a glove, take twice as long and twice the will. This was the environment the Whitlocks had decided they understood better than the man who had survived it 11 times. It is an environment that does not care in the slightest what you believe about yourself, where confidence and competence are two completely different things, and only one of them keeps you alive. I can't stand how good that extra oxygen must have felt, because feeling strong up there on borrowed gas is exactly the hook being set. Pemba saw it almost at once, the way they surged, the new energy that had no business existing on the flow he had set. He caught up, checked their gauges, and saw the needles sitting far lower than they should have been for that point on the route. He told them, in the plainest words he had, that they were burning their summit oxygen and their descent oxygen all at the same time, that the bottles would never stretch if they kept this up. They waved him off. They had paid for oxygen, they reminded him, and they intended to breathe it, and they did not appreciate being rationed like children on a mountain they had spent a small fortune to climb. That is the part I sit with, that he told them the actual life and death truth, in the simplest words he could find, and they heard it as a man being difficult. To them it was a customer service problem, a guide overstepping. To him it was a countdown that had already started. What stuns me is he handed them the truth, and to them it just registered as a man overstepping his place. They reached the balcony, a small shelf of snow at around 27,600 feet, just as the first gray of dawn came into the sky, and that was where Pemba began watching the weather, as closely as he watched the clock. Far to the west, out over the shoulder of the mountain, a long, smooth, lens-shaped cloud was forming and sitting on the wind, the kind of cloud that means nothing to someone who does not know what they are looking at and means everything to someone who does. It is the signature of a rising wind, high above, the jet stream dropping its edge back down onto the peak, and it is one of the oldest warnings the mountain knows how to give. Pemba had turned around on the sight of that exact cloud before, and he was alive partly because of it. He told them they needed to think hard right now about turning around. They were behind on time, they were low on oxygen, they should still have had plenty of, and the sky was beginning to tell him the afternoon would turn violent. The summit was still more than 1,000 feet above them, hours away at their real pace, and every one of those feet would have to be paid back on the way down. He laid all of it out as clearly as a man can lay anything out, and they laughed at him. They actually laughed, the two of them, standing up there in the thin gray light, because to them, a pretty little cloud and a nervous guide were simply not a reason to walk away from the most expensive photograph of their entire lives. They told him the weather looked perfectly fine. They told him he was being dramatic, that he obviously wanted an easy day, that this was exactly the sort of overcaution they had paid extra to rise above. It wrecks me that he read the sky perfectly, said the one thing that saves them, and they answered like he was canceling dinner. Pemba was their guide, not their jailer. On a guided climb, the final decision to keep going up still belongs to the client, and a Sherpa who physically drags a paying couple off the mountain against their will does not have a job to come home to. He had said the words. He had said them more than once, as plainly as they could be said. The Whitlocks heard the words and chose the summit anyway, and so Pemba did the only thing left to him, which was to stay close and try to keep two people alive who had just overruled the one person actually qualified to make the call. They clipped on and kept climbing into a sky that was quietly turning against them. There is a thing in mountaineering that experienced climbers will tell you is harder than any physical part of the climb, and that is the discipline of turning around. The mountain is right there. You can see it. You have spent years and a fortune and every ounce of yourself to get this close, and walking away from a summit you could almost touch is the hardest decision in the entire sport. That is exactly why so many of the dead on these peaks are found above their turnaround time and not below it. Strong and capable people who simply could not make themselves stop a few hundred feet from the top. Pemba knew that trap better than anyone, and he was watching two people who had never once in their lives been told no walk straight into it. I wish the mountain had some rule that could overrule a customer, but the awful part is that up there, it really doesn't. The last stretch to the top of Everest is the most exposed ground most people will ever stand on in their lives. The route runs along a knife of a ridge, with a sheer drop of thousands of feet down one side into Tibet, and thousands more down the other into Nepal, past the south summit, across a narrow corniced traverse, and up the famous step just below the summit before the final snow slope to the top. It is slow, technical, and completely unforgiving, and the Whitlocks moved across it far more slowly than they believed they were moving, because the oxygen they had wasted was running thin now, and the altitude was dulling them in ways they could not feel from the inside. It was already past the middle of the day when they finally stood on the summit of the world, and for a few minutes, it was everything they had pictured. The whole earth fell away beneath their boots, the curve of the horizon, the brown plateau of Tibet on one side, and the green valleys of Nepal on the other, and they got their photographs, the flags, the poses, the brand moment of a lifetime captured at 29,000 feet. But the light was already wrong. The smooth cloud Pemba had spotted at dawn had grown and spread and was climbing the mountain toward them. The wind had a new edge in it that had not been there an hour before, and the warmth of standing on top was already curdling into the cold dread of a man who knew exactly how late it had gotten. They had also taken far too long to get there. The traffic on the fixed lines, the awkward, oxygen-starved fumbling at every transition, the photos they kept stopping for, all of it had eaten the morning, and they had topped out hours later than any safe schedule allows. Up high, time is not just time. It is oxygen burning and weather building and daylight bleeding away. And every minute they had spent celebrating was a minute stolen from the descent. They still had to survive. Pemba had watched the clock the whole way up with a quiet, growing dread, because he understood what the numbers meant, even when the Whitlocks could not feel them. They believed they had won. He knew they were only very far from finished. I think the saddest image in this whole story is that summit photo. Two people grinning on top of the world, already never going home. Because here is the brutal arithmetic of that mountain, the thing every experienced climber carries in their bones. The summit is not the goal, it is the halfway point, and it is the halfway point reached at your most exhausted and most depleted, with the harder, deadlier half still ahead of you, and the weather getting worse by the minute. Far more people die on Everest going down than ever die coming up, and they die for exactly the reasons that were now stacking themselves against the Whitlocks. They started down, and within minutes the mountain collapsed into white. The cloud Pemba had read at dawn swallowed the upper ridge whole, and the world that had been endless and clear from the summit became a roaring, blinding nothing, wind-driven snow erasing the route only a few feet in front of their faces. This is the exact scenario that kills people up there. The descent from the summit caught in a whiteout, when the fixed line and the boot pack are the only things tying a climber to the safe path down, and everything past them is a void falling away in every direction. It scares me how cleanly the mountain hides the danger behind the summit, because the top feels like the finish when it's barely halftime, and now the oxygen ran out. First Tate's bottle, then Sloane's. The gas they had been so eager to breathe down, finally gone, far above the safety of the coal, and there was nothing left to give them, because the high flow they had run all day had burned clean through the whole supply, the spare bottles included. Without it, at that altitude, in that cold, the change in them was fast and terrifying. Their movements went clumsy and slow. Their thinking, already dulled, started to come apart at the seams. Hypoxia at that height does not simply exhaust a person. It takes the judgment first, the starved brain turning slow and stubborn, and sometimes openly hostile, so that the very moment they most needed to listen was the moment they had become least able to. The moment the gas runs dry is the one I can't shake, because everything after it was already decided when they laughed at him. This is how the worst disasters on this mountain have almost always unfolded. Not one dramatic catastrophe, but a slow stacking of small, ordinary failures, a late start, a little too much oxygen burned too soon, a warning brushed aside until a climber is standing exhausted and blind in a storm on the most dangerous ground on earth with no margin left for a single mistake. Up there, a person does not have to do anything spectacular to die. They only have to lose the rope, or take one step in the wrong direction, or sit down to rest in a place where sitting down is the same as giving up. The Whitlocks were now doing very nearly all of it at once, and this is the cruelest knot in the whole thing, because now the arrogance and the altitude were pulling in the exact same direction. A humble person would still have been impaired up there, of course, but a humble person would have spent the whole climb listening, would have trusted the man beside them on pure instinct, and might well have been led down on reflex alone. The Whitlocks had spent the entire mountain training themselves to ignore him. It guts me that the one habit that saves them, just trusting Pemba, was the exact habit they'd refused to build all climb. Pemba did everything a human being can do up there. He fought his way to them in the whiteout and tried to clip them firmly back onto the fixed line, the single thread connecting them to the route down, and he tried to short rope them, to tie them directly to his own harness so he could control their descent and catch them if either one fell, which is the standard thing a guide does for a failing client on lethal ground. It is not an insult, it is the most protective act one climber can offer another, and even then, even blind and freezing and dying on their feet, some broken mix of their pride and their hypoxia made them fight him on it. Sloane wrenched herself free of the short rope, snapping that she would not be hauled around like a piece of luggage. And Tate, confused and belligerent, and barely himself anymore, reached down and unclipped his own harness from the fixed line in the middle of the whiteout, the one thing that absolutely no one is ever supposed to do up there, because he wanted to move his own way and would not be tied to anyone. Now neither of them was attached to anything at all, not the line, not the rope, not Pemba. He was already lunging for them, shouting into the wind for them to clip back in, when Tate, with Sloane only a step behind him, walked onto ground he could not see, ground that was not the road at all, and the slope he expected to be under his boot simply was not. I've read this part more times than I should, and I still can't believe he undid the one clip tying him to the living world. He fell, and the rope he had refused to be tied into was not there to catch him, and Sloane, unroped now herself and barely a step away, lunged for him on pure instinct and went off the edge with him, the two of them gone into the white in the space of a single breath. Pemba threw himself forward and got a gloved hand on a trailing strap and felt it tear straight through his fingers, and then there was nothing at all. No weight, no rope, just the wind and the snow and the empty place on the ridge where two people had been standing a heartbeat before. They fell thousands of feet down the face of the mountain, dead within seconds of shoving away the very last hand that was trying to hold on to them. Pemba Rinzin somehow brought himself down alive, frostbitten and broken, and radioed what had happened to the team below. The expedition operator notified the local authorities and the Whitlock's family, and the slow, grim work of a high-altitude death began, the part the brochures never show. Recovering a body from a fall like that, on that terrain, in the death zone, is a mission that risks the lives of the living, and on the highest mountain on Earth, it very often cannot be done at all. The mountain the Whitlocks believed they had bought a clean passage up had simply kept them. It haunts me that the man they mocked the entire way up was the only reason anyone on Earth ever learned how they died. The man they had mocked the entire climb, whose name they never once managed to say right, was the only reason anyone ever knew what happened on that ridge. He had been right about the pace, the oxygen, the cloud at dawn, the rope, every single thing they laughed at, and he stayed with them to the last second, trying to undo choices that were never his to make. They had spent a fortune and a lifetime of certainty to stand on top of the world, and the one thing that could have carried them home was the single thing their money could not buy, and their pride would not let them take, the humility to listen to the man who knew the way down. It was May 18th, 2023 on Mount Everest, during a narrow summit window within the climbing season, with clear pre-dawn conditions at the South Col and a forecasted weather system expected to move in within the following days. Graylin Baldwin was a 29-year-old outdoor content creator from Boulder, Colorado, who spent the past 5 years building a life around high-altitude trekking, cold weather expeditions, and solo travel documented for an online audience. She also worked remotely as a fitness coach, combining income streams to fund increasingly demanding expeditions without relying entirely on sponsorship support. Her most ambitious project, publicly announced in February 2023, was an attempt on Mount Everest. The announcement drew significant attention and immediate feedback from viewers, including detailed concerns from people familiar with high-altitude climbing. She responded by stating she had conducted extensive research and was working with experienced, vetted guides. "I don't think doing research is the problem. Nobody climbs Everest without preparing. The question is whether you're learning from people who've actually been up there or just collecting information that sounds convincing." The expedition budget was approximately $65,000, covering permits, logistics, oxygen systems, technical gear, and support personnel. A large portion was funded through brand partnerships tied to expedition content, including deliverables requiring summit footage and post-climb documentation. This introduced structural pressure into the expedition timeline, where delays or failure to summit would carry financial and contractual consequences beyond the climb itself. Like many climbers preparing for high-altitude expeditions, Graylin organized extensive reference material during her training phase, including expedition reports, medical resources, and climbing guides. She also used AI-assisted tools to help structure and summarize this information into a more accessible format. Eventually, she compiled a detailed offline document stored on her phone containing notes, checklists, and decision guides covering acclimatization, oxygen management, altitude illness, and summit planning for use as a field reference during the expedition. I've gone through a lot of expedition planning setups, but this is one of the few times I've seen a phone document start carrying more weight than the guide beside her. In practice, This system functioned as an organizational tool for expedition planning rather than a real-time decision authority. It translated complex and variable environmental and physiological factors into simplified procedural rules intended for field reference. While the underlying information aligned with established mountaineering guidance, the output format emphasized consistency and optimization over situational discretion. Operational decision-making in high-altitude environments is typically adjusted dynamically by experienced guides based on real-time physiological observation, pacing tolerance, and environmental change. This adaptive layer cannot be fully represented in static planning frameworks. The document also covered summit timing. One of the ideas she pulled from it was that an earlier weather window could mean fewer people on the route, less waiting around at bottlenecks, and ultimately less time spent in the death zone. Later on, that became part of her reasoning for choosing May 9 instead of waiting until May 10, like her guide recommended. By this point, the document had become something she relied on pretty heavily. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was something she kept going back to when decisions needed to be made. The information itself wasn't necessarily bad. A lot of it came from legitimate climbing resources. But Everest isn't the kind of place where you can always pull out a set of guidelines and expect them to fit what's happening right in front of you. Sometimes the person who's standing beside you, looking at you, watching how you're moving and breathing, knows something a document never could. Supplemental oxygen slows this decline, but does not prevent it. Standard climbing flow rates in the death zone are around 3 liters per minute. Below 2 liters, the protective effect drops significantly, and at 1.5 liters, the physiological impact begins to approximate climbing without oxygen, only delayed in progression rather than prevented. On Everest, that's one of those details I've seen guides verify almost automatically because they've been in situations where getting it wrong escalated things fast. The 2023 season featured a narrow mid to late May summit window, with conditions on May 18th identified as viable before a forecasted weather system expected around May 20 to May 21. Expected winds ranged from 15 to 20 miles per hour, with summit temperatures near negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit and wind chill below negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Forecast notes also flagged uncertainty in timing, including the possibility of earlier system arrival. Above Camp 4, the route follows fixed ropes through steep, exposed terrain shared by multiple teams, creating bottlenecks during summit windows. The most significant congestion point is near the former Hillary Step area on the upper summit ridge at approximately 28,839 feet, where traffic often compresses into a single fixed-line bottleneck. Even in modern conditions, delays can vary significantly depending on congestion, weather, and rope management efficiency, with climbers frequently experiencing extended pauses in high-traffic summit windows. Graylin arrived at base camp on April 14th, 9 days before her first scheduled acclimatization rotation. She used the downtime for filming and expedition logistics before beginning her acclimatization schedule. She used ChatGPT to generate and organize guidance covering acclimatization planning, oxygen usage strategies, symptom recognition, weather window interpretation, and simplified forecasting checklists. These materials were incorporated into her broader planning document for field reference. While they were at base camp, her Sherpa guide recommended taking one more rest day before the next rotation. He wasn't completely comfortable with some of the readings he was seeing and thought a little more recovery time would be a good idea. Graylin chose not to make the change. She already had a timeline in mind for the expedition and wanted to stay on schedule. The discussion was later noted in the expedition log. If it were me, I'd have a hard time brushing off a guide asking for an extra rest day. They spend enough time watching climbers that those recommendations usually come from somewhere. The first rotation carried her from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall into the western Sidewulem, where she reached Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet after staged progress over multiple days. The Icefall section, one of the most technically dangerous parts of the standard South Col route, was completed without incident. After a short rest period back at base camp, she began a second rotation that carried her from base camp up toward Camp 3, where sleep quality and appetite began to noticeably decline under sustained altitude exposure. During a later rotation between Camp 2 and Camp 3, she developed a mild headache and reduced appetite at Camp 2. These symptoms were consistent with expected altitude effects, though her guide recommended a more conservative response, including additional rest and potential descent for reassessment. She referenced her prepared field notes and chose to remain at altitude under a hydration and recovery protocol. outlined in her planning material. She filmed briefly at camp and went to sleep. She returned to base camp the following day. Her guide recommended 2 full rest days before the next rotation. She took one. The second rotation began in early May. She ascended from base camp through Camp 1 and reached Camp 3 the next day, her highest elevation to that point. That night at Camp 3, she experienced markedly reduced sleep and significantly decreased food intake, both recognized indicators of incomplete acclimatization. While not diagnostic on their own, experienced guides use these combined patterns to assess physiological strain. Altitude. She did not explicitly report the severity of either to her guide the following morning. That night, she once again referred to her pre-compiled planning document, built from expedition reports, climbing resources, and AI-assisted summaries. The material suggested a conservative, overnight oxygen range of around 0.5 to 1 liter per minute as a theoretical efficiency guideline under rest conditions. She set her regulator to 1 liter per minute for sleep, while her guide used a higher flow rate of approximately 2 liters per minute in the adjacent tent under standard expedition protocols. She descended to base camp after the rotation and remained there for several days of rest before the next ascent phase. On the day of the summit decision, Graylin reviewed the long-range forecast, both with her guide and independently through her planning document. The document summarized common indicators of a viable summit window, including stable or rising barometric pressure, wind speeds below approximately 20 miles per hour, clear conditions, and a weakening or shifting jet stream. She applied these parameters to the available forecast data and assessed the approaching window as viable. The expedition company's commercial forecasting service provided the same underlying meteorological data with additional interpretation, describing the window as workable but narrow. It also noted uncertainty in the timing of an incoming system, with potential arrival ranging from the following day to 2 days later, depending on model variation. Her guide, interpreting both the forecast and on-mountain conditions, expressed a preference for delaying the summit push by approximately 24 hours. I always find weather discussions interesting because the forecast and the mountain aren't necessarily having the same conversation. If I'm climbing with an experienced guide, I'd want to know why they're seeing something different. However, Graylin ultimately chose to proceed earlier, citing reduced traffic on fixed lines compared to the expected congestion in the later window. On the following day, the team, Graylin, her guide, and 2 Sherpa support crew moved from base camp to Camp 4 at the South Col. Her pace was slower than in previous rotations, with more frequent rest stops on fixed-line sections where other teams maintained continuous movement. At Camp 4, she ate a partial meal and entered her sleeping bag in the early evening hours. Before sleeping, she reviewed her reference document and finalized her oxygen plan based on a multi-bottle expedition setup, typically consisting of 3 to 4 oxygen cylinders for the full summit rotation. Her strategy used lower flow rates during the lower ascent phases and increased delivery near the summit and descent, intended to stretch supply across a longer than expected summit window. Her guide maintained a steady and continuous flow strategy at approximately 3 liters per minute throughout the upper mountain, consistent with standard expedition practice. Her pulse oximeter reading at Camp 4 registered 68%, a low value at that altitude that concerned her guide when combined with reduced sleep, appetite, and a slower movement profile. While oxygen saturation readings at extreme altitude can vary widely between individuals, the broader trend was consistent with increasing physiological strain. She recorded the value, but did not relay it to her guide. I wouldn't treat a number like that in isolation, but I also wouldn't ignore it in context with everything else happening physically. She woke shortly after midnight, having slept for fewer than 3 hours. The team left Camp 4 in the pre-dawn hours under clear skies and stable wind conditions. Temperatures were well below freezing, and headlamp beams from multiple teams ahead traced a continuous line up the southeast ridge. The forecasted summit window still appeared to be holding, and conditions at departure were assessed as favorable at a glance. Graylin recorded a brief departure clip before moving on to the upper route. The initial section above Camp 4 traverses open snowfield before steepening toward the triangular face and the balcony at roughly 27,600 feet. The balcony functions as the first major checkpoint on the upper ridge, where guides typically reassess climber condition before committing to the final ascent. Under normal conditions, this section takes 2 to 3 hours of steady progress. As the climb continued, the team's pace slowed, with Graylin moving noticeably more slowly than on previous rotations, as her guide stayed closer to keep the group together on the fixed lines. At the balcony, They discovered her oxygen system had been running at around 1.5 liters per minute since leaving Camp 4 instead of the planned 2 liters per minute, and it was immediately increased to 3 liters per minute. By then, she had already spent about 90 minutes in the death zone, receiving less oxygen than intended. From the balcony, the team continued toward the south summit as dawn remained several hours away, and the margin for error narrowed. The south summit, the last practical decision point before the final ridge, came after several more hours of slow progress along the fixed lines, with her movement becoming increasingly labored and frequent short pauses required after minimal forward gain. At that elevation, her guide noted a clear decline in pace and efficiency in rope handling. Based on her condition, the time already spent in the upper death zone, and the remaining distance to the summit, he recommended turning back. One thing I always watch for in accounts like this is when basic tasks start taking noticeably more effort. To me, that's often more concerning than any single number on a device. She acknowledged the recommendation, but chose to continue upward. Feeling conditions remained within the forecasted summit window as dawn began to break and winds stayed within expected ranges, though the incoming weather system was now advancing faster than later model projections, narrowing the margin for a safe stay or delayed descent. The final section from the south summit to the true summit follows a narrow, corniced ridge before reaching the former Hillary Step area, now a major bottleneck on the southeast ridge route where multiple teams converge, and the movement on fixed lines requires careful use of Jumar ascenders. Small errors at this stage carry immediate consequences due to exposure, fatigue, and extreme altitude, and the same terrain becomes equally demanding on descent under reduced cognitive and physical capacity. Graylin cleared this section and reached the summit in the early morning hours, among the later arrivals from the south side teams during that window, with conditions cold, windy, and clear under full daylight exposure. She remained on the summit for an extended stop, recording multiple angles of footage, including sponsor acknowledgments and direct-to-camera segments. I get why she wanted to stay. If I'd spent years working towards standing on top of Everest, I would also want to soak in every second too. Most other climbers limited their summit time to brief stops before descending, consistent with standard practice at that altitude. Within a short period, Graylin's coordination on the fixed line deteriorated beyond the level of fatigue typically expected during descent. She showed increasing difficulty with sequential rope management, including controlled transitions between anchors and maintaining balance on steep, exposed terrain where minor errors carry immediate consequence. At the Hillary Step on descent, she was no longer able to independently manage her Jumar and fixed line transitions. Her guide intervened directly, assisting with clipping and unclipping while positioning himself above her to maintain control of her attachment system. Other climbers were delayed behind the team during this section, as the passage through the bottleneck slowed significantly at high altitude. The descent was getting slower and slower. Between the Hillary Step and the south summit, Graylin made 2 unplanned stops on the fixed line. During those pauses, she didn't consistently respond when people spoke to her and often remained motionless until someone prompted her to move. By this point, it was becoming clear that this was more than exhaustion. She wasn't just slowing down physically, she was also having trouble responding and making decisions on her own. By mid-morning, the team had passed the south summit on descent and was moving through the ridge toward the balcony. Wind conditions had strengthened, with increasing cloud cover advancing from the southwest and reducing overall visibility across lower elevations. Temperatures had dropped significantly, and wind chill conditions were becoming more severe. The incoming weather system was now arriving earlier than the more optimistic forecast projections had indicated. I think the 2 unplanned stops are easy to overlook when you're reading a long expedition report. But when someone just stops moving on a fixed line at nearly 29,000 feet and doesn't respond normally, that's not something I'd be comfortable ignoring. At a point during this descent, Graylin's supplemental oxygen supply was fully depleted. The exhaustion of supply resulted from cumulative consumption across the ascent, summit stay, and early descent phases, combined with earlier inefficiencies in regulator settings that led to uneven delivery rates. Although adjustments had been made at higher altitude, the remaining reserve had already been reduced under suboptimal usage conditions, leaving a limited buffer for the return. Her guide immediately transferred her onto a personal reserve bottle, restoring supplemental oxygen at a standard flow rate. Despite this intervention, her physical control continued to decline. She required continuous assistance to remain upright on the fixed line, with team members stabilizing her movement as her ability to bear weight became increasingly inconsistent. Her responsiveness diminished, and she ceased initiating movement without direct prompting. The descent rate slowed significantly as the team adapted to assisted movement conditions in exposed terrain. At this stage, the clinical trajectory was consistent with severe altitude-related cerebral impairment. High-altitude cerebral edema typically progresses from cognitive slowing to loss of coordination, followed by a collapse of autonomous motor function and eventual unresponsiveness if descent is not achieved. At extreme altitude, this progression is accelerated by continued hypoxia and physical exertion and cannot be reversed without sustained descent to lower elevations where oxygen availability improves. Although supplemental oxygen was briefly restored through the guide's reserve supply, the terrain, congestion, and environmental conditions limited the rate of descent below what would be required to meaningfully interrupt the physiological decline already underway. The section between the south summit and the balcony, roughly 1,100 vertical feet, is exposed, steep in sections, and requires deliberate individual movement on fixed lines that cannot be bypassed. A climber unable to bear their own weight must be physically assisted, and at nearly 28,000 feet in deteriorating conditions, that assistance becomes slow, inefficient, and increasingly costly for everyone involved. Over the course of the descent, the team covered only about 600 vertical feet in roughly 90 minutes, a pace reflecting near total loss of independent mobility from the primary climber. 4 descending climbers from other teams intermittently assisted, stabilizing her movement while also managing their own rapidly diminishing oxygen reserves. I always have a lot of respect for climbers who stop to help in situations like this. They're exhausted, they're burning through their own oxygen, and they still choose to get involved. Helicopter evacuations aren't possible at that altitude on Everest. The air is simply too thin, which meant there was no way for outside help to reach them. No rescue team could be flown in, and there wasn't another route down. The only way off the mountain was the same fixed line they were already on. By mid-morning, the guide's spare oxygen was gone. That meant the guide and both Sherpa team members were now above 27,000 feet without supplemental oxygen themselves. At the same time, the weather was getting worse. Winds were picking up, temperatures were dropping, and the clouds were starting to close in around the ridge. Running out of backup oxygen up there is something I can't even imagine dealing with. Every option suddenly becomes worse at the exact moment you need options most. By late morning on the southeast ridge, at roughly 27,200 feet, about 900 vertical feet above Camp 4, Gray Lynn was no longer responsive. She had become fully non-ambulatory on the fixed line, unable to bear weight or follow verbal directions. At that point, forward movement was no longer possible. She was secured in place on the rope while the team initiated emergency radio contact with base camp. With their own supplemental, oxygen exhausted and exposure time continuing to accumulate, the 2 Sherpa support crew were advised to begin immediate descent to reduce further risk. The guide remained with her as conditions worsened. Through the early afternoon, the weather degraded rapidly. Winds strengthened into sustained gale force conditions, and wind chill dropped well below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility collapsed as cloud cover and blowing snow overtook the ridge. By late afternoon, Gray Lynn showed no response to repeated checks and no detectable pulse. She was pronounced deceased at location via base camp medical radio protocol at approximately 27,200 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The guide later descended with assistance from a Sherpa recovery team dispatched once communication confirmed the situation. The body remained secured on the fixed line due to conditions and altitude constraints. Gray Lynn's body was recovered several days later after the weather system had cleared. A 5-person recovery team coordinated through the expedition. Logistics provider and operating under authorization from Nepal's tourism authorities completed the operation in roughly 13 hours round trip from base camp. Her camera, phone, and personal equipment were recovered and returned to her family. The phone contained footage through the summit and approximately 9 minutes into the descent before recording stopped. I can't help but think about those final recordings. At the time, they were probably meant to document an achievement, and now they're part of the last record of what happened on the mountain. A formal post-expedition review was later conducted by the logistics provider and an independent high-altitude medicine consultant retained by her family. The review identified the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema with secondary hypoxic cardiac arrest. Contributing factors included reduced oxygen flow rates during the ascent, limited acclimatization, in recovery time, extended time spent at the summit, and a delayed descent after the onset of significant cognitive impairment. The review found no direct negligence on the part of expedition staff. It also noted that the reference material recovered from her phone contained generally accurate mountaineering information, but that it could not substitute for real-time physiological assessment and field judgment under extreme altitude conditions. It was October 4th, 2020, and somewhere above 26,000 feet on Dhaulagiri, two Americans were still climbing toward the summit, long after the hour their head Sherpa had begged them to turn around. Dhaulagiri is the seventh highest mountain in the world. 26,795 feet of rock and ice rising out of central Nepal, and its name comes from old words that simply mean the White Mountain. From a distance, it is one of the most beautiful things you will ever see, a vast, shining pyramid of snow standing over one of the deepest river gorges on the planet, the Great Trench of the Kali Gandaki running between Dhaulagiri and its rival Annapurna. Up close, it is something else entirely, a place that has killed a long list of very good climbers and shows no sign of slowing down. It was first climbed in 1960, and since then it has earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous of all the big peaks. The weather turns violent with almost no warning. The snow loads onto the slopes and slides without asking, and the summit day is long and cold in a way the photographs never show. People who have climbed all over the Himalaya will tell you Dhaulagiri scared them. That is the mountain Anson Reardon and Roman Sable were certain they were ready for. Weeks before they left home, Roman had already laid the whole climb out online for everyone who followed them, the way the two of them laid out everything. There was the training block written up in detail, the months on the treadmill and the indoor wall, the heart rate zones, a gear list worked down nearly to the gram. There was the acclimatization schedule and a summit day timeline broken into hours, the move to high camp, the start in the dark, the turnaround time, the descent. He wrote that they had read every account of the mountain they could find and built the plan around the numbers, that the two of them had done the work, and this was simply the execution phase. He signed off the way he ended everything that season, certain and upbeat, telling everyone they had modeled every variable that mattered, and that the data did not lie, and that the next big post would come straight from the summit of the seventh highest mountain on Earth. It's wild to me that these two guys with at least some actual experience behind them still underestimated one of the deadliest mountains on Earth and figured their spreadsheets had it solved. The trek should have been the first warning. It takes the better part of 2 weeks just to reach the foot of Dhaulagiri, and when the trail finally tips over a high pass, the mountain stands in front of you, enormous and silent and completely indifferent. Most people feel a kind of healthy fear in that moment, the sudden understanding that the thing in the photographs is real and very large and does not care that you are coming. If Anson and Roman felt any of it, they did not show it. 2 weeks of walking towards something that size is supposed to teach a person humility, and somehow it taught these two, only that they were still on schedule. Anson was 28 and Roman was 27, and they had met years earlier writing software at the same company in the Pacific Northwest. By the time of this story, they had money, the sudden kind that arrives when a company you helped build gets bought, and the particular confidence of men who are very good at one difficult thing. They could take a hard problem apart, model it, and solve it, and it had always worked for them before. Nobody who knew them would have called them fools. The trouble is that a mountain is not a system. It does not negotiate, and it keeps no record of how clever you were on the way up. All the way in, the updates kept coming. For 2 weeks, Roman posted from the trail almost every day, a photo of the path winding up into thinner air, a shot of a tea house, a note that the team felt strong and was right on schedule. When the mountain finally rose into view over the last high pass, enormous and white and silent across the valley, he posted the picture everyone had been waiting for and wrote that it was so much bigger than the photographs, that just standing there looking at it gave him chills. But the message underneath was the same as always, that seeing it up close only made him more sure because they had planned for exactly this. And a plan does not get smaller just because the mountain turns out to be huge. Anson posted almost nothing and saved it all for the log on his phone. It baffles me that just because of some heavily guided walk-ups like Aconcagua and Denali made these two think that a mountain as deadly as Dhaulagiri would just be the next one on the list. On paper, their climbing record looked respectable, the kind that makes a person feel ready. They had walked up Kilimanjaro, ground their way to the top of Aconcagua, and suffered through the cold of Denali, real mountains that had taught them they could hurt and keep going. But every one of those had been a guided summit handed to them in good conditions. None of them an 8,000er, and not one carried the steep, technical, avalanche-loaded danger of the mountain they had chosen now. A stack of big walk-ups is not the same as being ready for one of the deadliest peaks in the Himalaya, and somewhere in all their research, the two had blurred that line until they could no longer see it. When they found an expedition company in Kathmandu willing to take paying clients up Dhaulagiri with full Sherpa support and bottled oxygen, the only thing left between these two and the mountain was money. And money they had. The autumn they chose was the autumn of 2020, which made the whole thing stranger still. Nepal had only just reopened to expeditions late that summer, with testing and paperwork and a fraction of the usual crowds, and the climbers who actually turned up were a small, hard, determined group. Anson and Roman handled the pandemic the way they handled everything, as a set of obstacles to be managed, forms to fill out, and tests to pass. A logistics problem with a clean solution. It did not seem to occur to them that a year when almost no one was climbing might be a year to wait, rather than just a year with shorter lines. And so, while half the world was still locked down, the two of them flew to the far side of it to climb the 7th highest mountain on the planet. From base camp, Roman wrote a long message home describing the whole setup, the cluster of tents on the glacier, the cook tent, the prayer flag strung over everything, and the team of Sherpas who would be climbing with them. He wrote about the Sirdar, a quiet man named Nuru, who had apparently been up here more times than Roman could quite believe. He said the guides were careful, maybe a little too careful for his taste, always talking about resting another day, waiting for better snow, being ready to turn around, and that he respected it, but that he and Anson had not crossed a locked-down world to play it safe. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that whenever Nuru read the weather off the sky, the two of them would quietly check it against the forecast on their phones, and that so far the phones had been every bit as good. He signed off saying the models showed a window opening in early October and that they would be ready for it. At base camp, they met the men who would actually keep them alive, a team of Sherpas led by a Sirdar named Nuru, with a younger, steady climbing Sherpa named Dorje among them. On a properly run expedition, each client climbs the hard ground with his own personal Sherpa. So up high, it would fall to Nuru to shadow the one of them and to Dorje the other. Nuru was in his middle 40s and had been climbing these mountains since he was a teenager. He had stood on the summits of several 8,000ers and, just as importantly, had turned around just short of a few others and walked home alive. He read the weather in the sky and the snow under his boots, and most of all he read people. It did not take him long to read Anson and Roman, and what he saw worried him in a way he had learned never to ignore. Nuru had forgotten more about these mountains than those two would ever learn, and they still kept overruling him with a phone app. I would have walked off the mountain right there. Anson kept a log through the rotations, the same way he logged everything. A few clipped lines tapped into his phone at the end of each day. The entries read like a spreadsheet that had been taught to talk. The altitude reached, the hours spent moving, the resting heart rate, the blood oxygen number off his watch, and a one-word grade for how the day had gone. On the days the climbing wrecked him, the days he could barely eat, and his head pounded in the tent all night, the log still recorded a saturation number he had already decided was acceptable and a note that the trend was holding. He wrote down the schedule Nuru wanted, and then wrote down the schedule they actually kept, which was rarely the same. Nowhere in any of those entries was there a line for fear, or for the way the thin air up high had started to feel like a hand pressing on his chest, because those were not things that fit in a column, and what did not fit in a column did not quite count. The acclimatization rotations were where the cracks first showed. Climbing a peak like this means going up and back down several times before any summit push, sleeping a little higher each round, and on every rotation, the two were among the slowest people on the mountain, well behind the schedule Nuru set, stopping constantly to gather themselves. When Roman felt truly awful, he would check the oxygen reading on his watch, see a number he had already decided was acceptable, and keep pushing. When Nuru suggested an extra rest day or a slower pace, the two would hear him out politely and then do more or less what they had planned all along, because they simply could not believe that a man without their schooling knew something they did not. There was one rotation, partway up, that should have ended the whole thing right there. A short stretch of steep, exposed snow that the seasoned climbers around them crossed quickly gave Roman real trouble, and he hung off the fixed line far longer than was safe, fumbling with his gear while Nuru talked him through it, inch by inch. At the top of it, he was shaking, and for one moment, even he seemed to understand exactly where he was. The mountain had shown them, as plainly as it knew how, exactly how thin the margin really was, but by the next morning, it had already been filed away, as a bad day rather than the warning it was. That night, Roman wrote about the bad stretch on the fixed line, but by the time it reached the page, the fear had already been filed off. He called it a tricky little section, said he had gotten pumped and had to stop and breathe and let Nuru talk him through it, nothing the guides could not handle. He noted almost proudly that his recovery score had come back green the next morning, as if a good number on his wrist at breakfast could erase what his own body had been screaming at him the day before while he hung off that rope. He finished the entry the way he finished all of them, saying he felt stronger every day and that the summit was starting to feel less like a question and more like a date already circled on the calendar. I think it's just crazy how the mountain literally left Roman shaking on a rope, but because the next morning he saw a good number on his watch and thought he was fine. Altitude is the great equalizer, and it does not care about any of the things these two had built their confidence on. Above a certain height, the body simply begins to fail, the thinking slows, the judgment frays, and no amount of cleverness at sea level changes what happens to a brain starved of oxygen at 25,000 feet. The Sherpas saw it in them on every rotation. The slow decisions, the stubbornness hardening as the air thinned, and quietly, among themselves, they began to say the things mountain people say about clients they are worried about. And they kept doing their jobs anyway, fixing the ropes and carrying the loads, because that is the arrangement, and because hope is a hard thing to kill, even in men who have watched these stories finish before. The route ran up the northeast ridge from base camp at around 15,000 feet, through a Camp 1 and a Camp 2 to a high camp above 24,000 feet, with the summit still more than 2,000 feet above even that. All season, the mountain kept loading with fresh snow between the clear spells, and the Sherpas talked quietly about avalanche. One night low on the mountain, the whole camp woke to the long, rolling boom of a slide out in the dark, and in the morning the Sherpas studied the slopes above and said very little. Nuru had seen this mountain go from a calm blue morning to a screaming whiteout in a single afternoon, and he knew it did not warn you ahead of time, no matter what a forecast built 1,000 miles away promised on a screen. Look, I know that watch gives you a tidy little oxygen number, but I have never once seen the number on a man's wrist drag him back onto his feet. There is one last entry in Anson's log, written in the gray light of that final morning before they left for the top. He noted that Nuru had pulled them aside the evening before and told them plainly he did not love the window, that the slopes were too freshly loaded and the timing too tight, and that he would rather wait. Anson wrote it all down, the way he wrote everything down, and then beside it he set the numbers from the forecast he trusted. The low winds, the clear skies, the clean line on the graph. Between the man and the model, the entry made it perfectly clear which one he believed. He closed the log, noting that they had come too far and trained too hard to walk away from a window this good, and that the data was on their side. When the weather window finally came, it was a narrow one, and Nuru did not like it. He saw the window as thin and the mountain as far too freshly loaded with snow, and he would much rather have waited. But the season was running out. The clients had paid a great deal of money for the summit they came for, and a guide can warn a grown man only so many times before the man decides for himself. When the window finally showed up on the forecast, Roman posted that this was it. He walked everyone through the plan one more time. The move up to high camp, a few hours of rest, the start in the dark before midnight, the summit by mid-morning, then down and safe by the afternoon. He wrote that every model he and Anson trusted agreed on a calm, clear window, the cleanest they could have hoped for, and that after a year of training and a year of waiting out a shut-down world, the two of them were finally going to stand on top of Dhaulagiri. He told everyone to keep an eye out, because in a couple of days he would be sending a photo from the highest place either of them had ever stood. The climb to the high camp took them far longer than it should have, and they arrived later and more worn out than anyone wanted. Nuru watched them fumble with their gear in the cold, and did the math in his head that they would not do it for themselves, and he did not like the answer. The only safe plan was to rest a few hours and leave for the summit in the deep cold before midnight, so they would be on top in the early morning with the whole day to get back down. You climb in the dark, precisely so that you descend in the daylight, and there is no clever way around that rule. But the two were spent, slow getting ready, slow eating, slow pulling on their boots, and by the time they crawled out of the tents the night was gone, and the sky was graying in the east. They were beginning their summit day at the hour they should already have been finishing the first half of it. The night before they left that high camp, Roman sent one last short message home on the satellite device, the way he had at every single stop on the mountain. He told everyone the forecast still looked perfect, that the two of them felt strong, that the hardest part was behind them now, and that the very next picture he sent would be from the summit of Dhaulagiri. It was the last message either of them ever sent. You do not casually stroll out of high camp on an 8,000er after sunrise. Every climber alive knows that, and the Sherpas watched these guys do it like the clock was somebody else's problem. The morning climb was slow, and for a while it was beautiful. Exactly the thing they had pictured for a year. Up that high, the air holds only about a third of the oxygen it does at sea level, and even on bottled gas, their bodies were breaking down with every step, a clock running that no training has ever stopped. The few other climbers on the mountain that morning passed them coming down, already done and heading for safety, and more than one gave the late pair a long look before moving on. Nuru and Dorje stayed with them the whole way, Nuru watching the clouds stack up off to the west in a shape he did not like. The summit couloir rose ahead of them, a long, steep ribbon of snow toward the final ridge, and they ground up it, one breath at a time. By late morning, the two were still climbing, hours past the point where everyone else had turned for home, and the wind was beginning to rise. So Nuru called it. He told them, as plainly as the thin air let him, that it was finished, that the summit was not worth what it would cost to keep clawing toward it this late with that weather coming, and that the only thing that mattered now was getting down while getting down was still possible. He had turned back near the top of mountains before and lived to climb them another year, and he was asking these two to do the same. It was the most important thing anyone said on that mountain all season, and it came from the one person up there who understood exactly what was about to happen. Picture the most experienced man on the whole mountain telling you to turn around, and you answer him by holding up a forecast on a cracked phone screen. I mean, what do you even say? They did not listen. Anson checked the forecast on the phone, the clean line that still promised them hours, and he weighed the man in front of him against the model in his hand. And he chose the model. The top was so close they could almost touch it. So they kept climbing, and Nuru and Dorje, who had not abandoned two clients in their care, climbed with them, and the clouds the forecast did not believe in kept stacking higher and darker behind them. They reached the summit of Dhaulagiri in the early afternoon, hours behind, in a wind that was no longer the gentle thing the forecast had drawn. For a few minutes they had what they came for, the highest point for miles in every direction. Roman took the photographs, and then they turned to start down, into a sky gone flat and heavy gray, and the first hard gusts came tearing across the ridge, carrying snow, and the light began to fail, and the temperature dropped off a cliff. There were no other teams up there now, just the four of them and the weather. So they got their summit photo. They really did. And here's the part I really wish people understood. The top is the easy half, and the half that kills you is the climb back down. What came next was the exact thing Nuru had feared since the first rotation. The storm closed over them on the upper mountain, and the world shrank to the few feet the headlamps could reach, the wind tearing at them, fresh snow swallowing the track they had broken on the way up. The overlong day had burned through their bottled oxygen, and somewhere up there the gas ran low and then ran out, and without it, at that altitude, the cold closed in far faster. Roman began to slow, then to stumble, then to sit down in the snow, the way exhausted climbers do right before the end. Anson would not leave him, and the two Sherpas did everything human beings can do up there. They got them up, they short-roped them, they fought the weather and the failing bodies of two men who each outweighed them, foot by foot, down the mountain. Exhaustion at that altitude in that cold is not simple tiredness. It is the body beginning to shut itself down, and on Dhaulagiri more people die going down than going up. And then the two Sherpas reach the very edge of what was humanly possible. There is a point where the men who stay will simply die alongside the people they are trying to save, where the only choice left is a terrible one. Go down and live, or stay and let the mountain take 4 instead of 2. By now, neither client could stand on his own, and 2 spent, freezing men cannot carry 2 grown men down steep ground in a storm. They stayed until staying meant dying, and then Nuru and Dorje were forced to leave and climb down toward the high camp, carrying a weight no person should ever have to carry. But suddenly, turning their backs was the hardest thing either man had ever done on a mountain, and both of them knew it would follow them the rest of their lives. Both Sherpas stayed up there until one more minute would have killed them too, then had to turn and climb down without the men they were hired to bring home. I do not know how you carry that. That descent was the kind of thing that ages a person. Half frozen, picking their way down ground they could barely see, Nuru and Dorje reached the high camp and could do nothing but wait, listening to the storm tear at the tent and watching the door for 2 headlamps that never came. No signal came from the satellite device, and even if one had, it would have changed nothing, because nothing flies into a Dhaulagiri storm in the dark, and the height where the two had stopped sat far above any line a rescue could reach. Nuru had brought worse prepared clients down off worse ground than this, and the fact that he could not bring these two down would sit on him long after the frostbite healed. They did not come in the night. They did not come at first light. By the time the weather broke enough to send anyone up to look, every person on that mountain already understood what it had decided. Anson Reardon and Roman Sable never came down off Dhaulagiri. They died high on the mountain that night in the storm their forecast had sworn would not arrive. Somewhere above the high camp and within reach of the summit they had refused to let go of. The two men who had researched everything, modeled everything, and optimized everything were stopped cold by the one thing none of it could touch: a mountain in central Nepal that does precisely what it wants and has never once been impressed by anybody. Nuru and Dorje came down to base, camp alive, frostbitten, and hollowed out. The expedition company began the grim work that follows, notifying the liaison officer assigned to the climb, the local authorities down in the district, and through the company and the embassy, the two families still waiting for a photograph from the top. Once the weather broke, a helicopter searched the upper mountain, and Sherpas climbed as high as the risk allowed, but the two had died too high for anyone to reach, and Dhaulagiri did not give them back. What came down instead was the record of it, the cheerful messages Roman had sent from every camp, the long log on Anson's phone, and the forecast he had trusted with both their lives. A clean, confident line drawn across the worst day the mountain could have picked. Honestly, the Sherpas saw this whole thing coming weeks earlier at base camp, and that is the cruelest part. The two men with an answer for everything never thought to ask the people who knew. The Sherpas had understood it long before the end, the way they almost always do, because their knowledge is the kind you cannot download, earned one hard season at a time. Nuru had read those two at base camp and quietly known, and he had still gone up and still fought for them, because that is what those men do. Anson and Roman were not bad people. They were clever and confident, and they made the oldest mistake there is. They confused being smart with being safe. The mountain did not hate them. It simply did not care, and the people who did were the ones they never thought to listen to. It was August of 2022. K2 rises 28,251 feet along the border of Pakistan and China, making it the second highest mountain on Earth. It is also one of the deadliest. Near the summit, climbers must pass through the bottleneck, a narrow near-vertical couloir beneath unstable glacial ice where a single mistake can be fatal. Above 26,000 feet in the death zone, the body can no longer acclimatize or recover. It can only lose strength with every passing hour. At 27, Conan Alderwin was the oldest, a competitive powerlifter from outside Denver, Colorado. He had placed in regional meets twice and built a modest following around his training. He viewed most challenges through a simple lens. If his body was capable of doing something, then the rest was just excuses. His only exposure to the mountains had been a guided hike in Rocky Mountain National Park the previous summer, which he regarded as sufficient preparation for anything that followed. Mivjet Torik, 25, had been Conan's closest friend since high school. They trained at the same gym and shared the same confidence, although Miv expressed his more loudly. He had no climbing background whatsoever and had never needed one to feel certain about his own abilities. In most situations, confidence had carried him far enough that experience seemed optional. Arlo Kashmir, 26, documented nearly every part of his life. Workouts, meals, vacations, recovery sessions. Everything eventually became content. To him, K2 represented less of a mountain and more of an opportunity. He spent months planning camera angles, scouting potential shots from other climbers' footage, and upgrading equipment. By the time the trip began, he had invested more money in filming gear than in the equipment intended to keep him alive on the mountain. The youngest was Caius Gallabrook at 24. He trained harder than anyone else in the group and treated almost every physical challenge as a personal test. Being the youngest bothered him enough that he often pushed himself further, simply to avoid appearing weaker than the others. Up to that point, his body had always responded when he demanded more from it. He had never experienced the moment when effort alone stopped being enough. 4 different personalities, but they all seemed to value the same thing, proving they could do hard things. The mountain would challenge that belief in some very unforgiving ways. K2 is harder than Everest by almost every technical measure, despite being nearly 800 feet shorter. The route through the bottleneck is the primary reason It is a steep, exposed gully of hard ice approximately 300 feet long, angled at close to 80 degrees in its steepest sections, with a field of glacial seracs, massive, unstable ice towers, hanging above the left side of the route. The traverse above the bottleneck is a near horizontal section of exposed ice leading to the upper snowfields, sitting directly beneath those seracs with no protection from anything that breaks loose above. The death zone above 26,000 feet has roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. The body at that altitude is not performing. It is rationing. Every system slows: digestion, cognition, coordination, thermoregulation. The longer a person stays above that threshold without descending, the faster the deterioration compounds. People often compare K2 to Everest because of the height. The difference becomes a lot clearer when you look at the route. August on K2 is the tail end of the climbing season. The summit window narrows as the month progresses and weather systems become less predictable. By mid to late August, most experienced expeditions have either summited or packed out. Base camp population drops significantly, which means fewer people to notice when something goes wrong and fewer resources available when it does. The four of them started talking about K2 in the fall of 2021. Conan had come across a short documentary about the mountain and said out loud that the death rate was overstated, that most of the people dying up there were simply not fit enough to be there. The others agreed. By November, it had become a plan. They spent the next 8 months preparing. Conan shifted his training toward endurance, longer sessions, weighted stair climbs, loaded carries up and down parking garage ramps. He started doing 2 workouts a day, several times a week, and tracked every measurable aspect of his conditioning. Miv followed the same routine. Arlo added inclined treadmill sessions and weekend hikes with a weighted pack. Caius pushed harder than all of them. He trained with an elevation mask at the gym, believing it was helping him adapt to high altitude. In reality, it only restricted airflow. Nobody in the group saw a reason to question it. What they didn't do was hire a mountaineering coach or take a technical climbing course. They bought crampons, ice axes, harnesses, and cold weather gear from a reputable outdoor retailer, where a staff member spent nearly an hour explaining the basics. Afterwards, they practiced fitting crampons and handling ice axes in the parking lot outside. Conan walked away, feeling like he had it figured out. Parking lots are good places to learn what equipment does, but they're not particularly good at showing what it feels like to depend on it. Most of their equipment was functional, but much of their clothing was designed for winter training rather than high-altitude expeditions, the sort of gear that works well at a ski resort and struggles on an exposed ridge at -30 degrees. They left emergency oxygen behind because they saw it as unnecessary weight. They skipped an emergency bivouac sack for the same reason. What they did bring was a container of pre-workout powder, figuring it would help keep their energy up during the climb. Proper electrolyte supplements never made the packing list. They booked through a commercial operator, paid for permits and base camp logistics, and declined the guided climbing option entirely. The intake paperwork asked about previous high-altitude experience. Conan listed the Rocky Mountain hike and a ski trip that had reached around 11,000 feet. The others listed similar experience. Nothing was flagged because the form was administrative rather than evaluative. Pakistani regulations required a liaison officer to accompany the expedition, but his role was limited to administrative oversight. Once the climbers left camp, their decisions were their own. When the base camp logistics coordinator later offered to connect them with an experienced high-altitude guide for the summit push, Conan turned it down immediately. As far as he was concerned, they had spent 8 months preparing. They didn't need someone showing them how to climb a mountain. It's hard not to raise an eyebrow at that one. Turning down expertise on K2 is a bold move, especially when you're new to the mountain. They flew into Islamabad in late July of 2022 and reached base camp at approximately 16,900 feet after the standard multi-day approach trek. The approach gave them their first real physical feedback. Miv developed a headache on the second day of the trek that he put down to dehydration and ignored. Caius felt short of breath on the steeper sections and said nothing about it. Conan's pace dropped noticeably on the final approach day, though he pushed through it and arrived at base camp ahead of the others. The standard acclimatization process on K2 usually takes several weeks. Climbers move gradually up the mountain, spending nights at higher camps before descending to recover and repeating the process multiple times. The goal is to give the body time to adapt to progressively lower oxygen levels. Conan looked at that schedule and decided it was more than they needed. Instead, the group completed a single rotation to Camp 2 at roughly 21,000 feet, spent one night there, returned to base camp, rested for 2 days, and planned to go for the summit. Their entire acclimatization period lasted less than a week. While they were at base camp, they met a small team of experienced climbers who were working through their second rotation. Several had already climbed other 8,000-meter peaks. One afternoon, a climber in his late 40s struck up a conversation after noticing the 4 men setting up camp. He asked which expedition they were with and eventually asked about their acclimatization plan. When Conan explained it, the climber frowned. He said one rotation was not enough for K2. He had watched climbers with far more experience run into serious problems above the bottleneck after rushing the process. He also mentioned that the seracs above the traverse looked unstable and that conditions late in the season were not ideal. The climber wasn't trying to scare them or prove a point. He was simply sharing the kind of advice people tend to offer after spending enough time in the mountains. Conan thanked him and said they would keep it in mind. Once the conversation was over, Miv dismissed the warning as the opinion of someone who spent too much time thinking about what could go wrong. Caius agreed. He just happened to say it loud enough for the other camp to hear. The rotation to Camp 2 was more difficult than any of them had expected. Above base camp, the route is not a hiking trail, but a technical glacier approach marked by crevasses, fixed ropes, and long stretches of climbing at altitude. Arlo struggled on the ascent and reached camp nearly 40 minutes behind the others. A cough that had started as a minor irritation during the approach trek was becoming harder to ignore. He blamed the cold air. Caius reached camp without much trouble, but mentioned feeling lightheaded near the top of the climb. He described it as a brief head rush and never brought it up again. Conan and Miv spent most of the night drifting in and out of sleep. Neither woke up feeling rested. They returned to base camp the following day. Conan described the rotation as manageable and argued that 2 days of rest would be enough before a summit attempt. Nobody pushed back. Neither Miv's headaches nor Caius's lightheadedness disappeared completely during the rest period, but neither considered it worth mentioning. By the end of the evening, the plan was set. On the morning they left for the summit push, Miv woke up with a lingering headache. He took a couple of ibuprofen, packed his gear, and kept it to himself. At that point, the summit was finally close enough to feel real. Few people are eager to hit the brakes after coming that far. They left Camp 2 at 11:30 on the night of August 9th. The plan was to reach the bottleneck before dawn, when the colder temperatures kept the ice above it more stable. The temperature at departure was roughly negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with moderate wind. In the darkness, the mountain above them was little more than a black outline against a slightly lighter sky. Their headlamps illuminated only a few feet of ice at a time. Everything beyond that disappeared into the dark. The wind never really stopped. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was constant. After the first hour, it became one of those things that was impossible not to notice. The first several hours passed without any major problems. The pace, however, was slower than Conan had expected. The terrain above Camp 3 was more technical than anything they had encountered before. The Vix ropes were manageable, but using them efficiently in the dark, they were in thick gloves, and at altitude, it was another matter entirely. Arlo struggled with his ascender almost immediately. The mechanism was difficult to operate with cold, bulky gloves, and within the first 2 hours he had removed them 3 separate times to make adjustments. His cough had come back as well. It had been easy to ignore at base camp and easier still to explain away at Camp 2, but at this altitude it had a wet, rattling quality to it that was different from before. He said nothing about it and kept climbing. Each time his hands were exposed for somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute. The second time it happened, Caius told him to stop slowing everyone down. The comment seemed to get under his skin. The next time the ascender gave him trouble, Arlo pulled off his gloves and rushed through the adjustment. He put them back on each time without looking at his fingers. Arlo wasn't the first climber to think 30 seconds without gloves wasn't a big deal. At negative 22 degrees, that's a gamble with pretty ugly odds. Caius moved quickly on the fixed lines, pulling himself uphill faster than the others and waiting at anchor points with obvious impatience whenever he had to stop. At one point, he unclipped from the rope entirely on a lower angle section so he could move around a slower climber from another team. The climber immediately told him that was a bad idea and not something he should be doing on that terrain. Caius clipped back in at the next anchor and continued upward without saying a word. By that point, none of the four had eaten much of anything since leaving Camp 2. One of the challenges at extreme altitude is that hunger becomes unreliable. People stop feeling hungry and assume their bodies don't need fuel, even when the opposite is true. They had already spent more than 4 hours climbing in severe cold while taking in very few calories. The same problem applied to hydration. Every breath of cold, dry air pulled moisture from their bodies, and none of them had been drinking consistently. The pre-workout powder they had packed, mixed into water bottles that were already beginning to freeze, was the main thing any of them had consumed since the climb began. I think a lot of people underestimate how much eating becomes part of the job on a climb like this. The same goes for drinking, especially when the air is cold enough to hide how much water you're losing. By the time they reached the base of the bottleneck, at roughly 27,200 feet, it was approaching 5 in the morning. Caius had been dealing with the same lightheadedness that had shown up at Camp 2. It had never fully gone away during the rest days, and somewhere above Camp 3, it had become more constant, a persistent unsteadiness that made him fix his eyes on each anchor point rather than think about what it meant. Conan had slowed noticeably over the previous hour. At first glance, it looked like caution. In reality, he was having to focus on things that had seemed automatic earlier in the climb. Every foot placement took more attention. He had stopped making conversation altogether. Miv wasn't doing much talking either. He stayed close behind Conan, breathing heavily as they climbed. It wasn't just the sound of someone working hard. Even when they stopped briefly, his breathing never seemed to settle. Arlo removed his gloves again at the base of the bottleneck to adjust a strap on his pack. With the wind chill, the temperature was below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. He spent nearly 2 minutes working with bare hands before finally getting the strap secured. When he pulled his gloves back on, his fingers felt thick and strangely unresponsive. He flexed them a few times and continued upward. The bottleneck itself is a steep, narrow gully of ice roughly 300 feet long. In its steepest sections, the angle approaches 80 degrees. The fixed rope running through it is the route. Stepping away from it isn't a shortcut or an alternate line. It's simply taking on a lot more risk for no real gain. They cleared the bottleneck just before 6 in the morning and reached the start of the traverse. This is where the climb began to unravel. Conan stopped at the start of the traverse and did not move for several minutes. He was still on his feet, but he wasn't making any progress. For the past 2 hours, he had been dealing with a severe headache that he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Over the previous 30 minutes, he had also begun struggling with his balance. He had stumbled twice while moving through the bottleneck, catching himself on the fixed rope both times and blaming it on fatigue. By the time he reached the traverse, something more serious was happening. Questions that normally would have gotten an immediate response now seemed to take a few seconds to register. He eventually sat down on the ice at roughly 27,400 feet and said he needed a minute. The words still made sense, but there was something off about the way he spoke. His responses were slower. His speech was slightly slurred. He wasn't being stubborn anymore, and he wasn't choosing to ignore the problem. His brain was swelling from the altitude, and that made it increasingly difficult for him to understand how serious his condition had become. He sat down on the ice and never got back up. All that training had prepared him to keep moving. Knowing when to stop turned out to be the harder skill. Miv's condition had also been getting worse since the bottleneck. At one point, he vomited beside the fixed rope and told nobody about it. His balance had deteriorated as well. He had stumbled twice on the approach to the traverse, catching himself on the rope both times. He wasn't saying much anymore. Most of his attention seemed focused on putting one foot in front of the other. He stayed close to Conan and never left his side. When Caius tried to get Conan back on his feet, Miv was sitting a few feet away on the ice. He was still conscious, but he no longer seemed aware of what was happening around him. The GPS device he was carrying recorded its final movement at 6:41 that morning. Arlo reached them and tried to unclip his camera from the chest harness. His right hand wouldn't cooperate. The fingers moved, but they wouldn't grip. He switched to his left hand and eventually managed it, but that hand wasn't much better. The movements were slower, weaker, and noticeably clumsy. He hadn't felt pain in either hand for over an hour. By that point, the damage was already well beyond the earliest stages of frostbite. Of the four, Caius was still functioning the best. He had a headache and was breathing hard, but he was still thinking clearly and moving normally. He told Conan to get up and keep moving. Conan answered, but the response didn't make much sense. Caius waited a moment and tried again. Nothing changed. For the first time that morning, it was clear that Conan wasn't just tired. By then, there wasn't really a good decision left to make. Staying meant not moving. Moving meant leaving Conan behind. At that point, he and Arlo turned around and started back toward the bottleneck. Arlo could still walk, but managing his equipment had become a problem. He struggled with carabiners, couldn't grip the fixed rope properly, and would have had little chance of stopping himself if he slipped. Caius moved ahead and handled as much of the rope work as he could for both of them. The descent was difficult, even under normal circumstances. With worsening wind, a deteriorating partner, and terrain this steep, the margin for error was almost non-existent. Partway down the bottleneck, Arlo's footwork had become unreliable enough that he was no longer placing his feet cleanly. One of his crampons snagged on the fixed rope. By then, even simple movements were taking more concentration than they should have. He tried to free it, but couldn't manage it with his hands. Moments later, he lost his footing and came off the line. Caius was directly below him. The impact pulled Caius off the route as well. He fell roughly 280 feet down the ice face below the bottleneck before the slope finally eased and brought him to a stop in a shallow depression. He survived the fall, but the injuries were severe. Later examinations found a fractured left fibula and blunt force trauma consistent with multiple broken ribs. He could not stand, and there was no realistic way for him to continue descending on his own. Arlo came to rest about 60 feet above him, caught against a small ice feature on the slope. He had survived too, but both of his hands were effectively unusable. He couldn't rescue himself, and he couldn't get to Caius. The temperature on the slope was below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had been increasing steadily since early morning. Neither Arlo nor Caius could get themselves to a lower elevation. No other climbers were on that section of the route, and although the group had brought a radio, they had never established a check-in schedule with anyone at base camp before leaving. Nobody was expecting to hear from them at any particular time. At that altitude and in those conditions, hypothermia progresses quickly. Both men were already exhausted, dehydrated, and operating with severely limited oxygen. Without shelter, without the ability to keep moving, and with no realistic prospect of immediate rescue, neither had a meaningful survival window measured in more than a few hours. Arlo's GPS recorded no movement after 7:52 that morning. Caius's device continued to register small positional shifts until approximately 11 o'clock before going still as well. He had survived on the slope for nearly 4 hours after the fall. No distress call was ever made from the group at any point. Back at base camp, nobody immediately realized anything was wrong. There was no scheduled check-in and no confirmed return time. The experienced climbers they had spoken with earlier were the first to raise concerns after noticing the group's absence. The issue was brought to the attention of the base camp coordinator, and a search assessment was initiated on the morning of August 11th. Weather on the 10th made any movement on the upper mountain impossible. High winds and poor visibility above Camp 3 eliminated any realistic chance of reaching the bottleneck area. By the time conditions improved enough for a search team to move, the outcome had already been decided. A 2-person team from the experienced expedition reached the bottleneck area on August 12th and located Arlo and Caius on the slope below it. Conan and Miv were found on the traverse above the bottleneck the following day. No recovery of the bodies was possible given the location and conditions. The search team documented the positions, collected the equipment they could safely reach, and descended. Conan Alderwin and Miv Jet Torek were found within 50 feet of each other on the traverse above the bottleneck at approximately 27,400 feet, both in seated positions. Investigators determined that both had died from high-altitude cerebral edema after continuing upward despite progressively worsening neurological symptoms. Contributing factors included the compressed acclimatization schedule, the failure to descend after symptoms appeared, and altitude-related warning signs that had been ignored throughout the climb. Conan's GPS device recorded its final movement at 6:38 on the morning of August 10th. Miv stopped 3 minutes later at 6:41. Time-stamped photographs recovered from Arlo's camera showed both men standing at the base of the bottleneck at 5:15 a.m. Less than 90 minutes before their GPS data went static, Arlo Kashmir was found on the ice face below the bottleneck at approximately 26,800 feet. Investigators determined that he died from hypothermia, an exposure after severe frostbite left both hands effectively unusable. The damage was consistent with repeated periods of unprotected exposure accumulated throughout the climb rather than a single incident. His camera was recovered intact. The final image on the device was a wide shot taken from the base of the bottleneck at 5:22 that morning. Caius Gallabrook was found roughly 60 feet below Arlo on the same slope. Investigators determined that he died from hypothermia and exposure after the fall below the bottleneck left him unable to continue the descent. His injuries included a fractured fibula and multiple broken ribs. GPS data confirmed that his position had not changed after 11 o'clock that morning. No shelter had been deployed. The radio recovered from his pack was still functional and showed no indication that it had ever been used. The permits, GPS tracks, recovered photographs, and equipment were later reviewed by the expedition operator and the relevant mountaineering authority. GPS data showed the group's ascent line deviating from the established route at multiple points, including sections consistent with unroped movement on technical terrain. The four of them came to K2 believing that physical strength could solve most problems. Up there, strength could get you higher. It couldn't always get you back down. It was May 17th, 2019. Mount Everest sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet at 8,849 meters above sea level, the highest point on Earth. The South Col route on the Nepal side is the most traveled path to the summit, winding through glaciers, ice falls, and high mountain camps above the clouds. Emmerich Pendleton was a 34-year-old fitness entrepreneur from Denver. He had gained a loyal online following by sharing content about training, discipline, and self-improvement, and believed that enough preparation could overcome almost any challenge. After climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and completing a winter ascent of a Colorado 14er, he set his sights on Everest, documenting the journey as the next step in a goal he had been pursuing for years. He trained hard, did his research, and believed he was ready. But Everest above 8,000 meters isn't just a test of fitness. It's a test of physiology, and no amount of training can fully prepare the body for that altitude. And his gym friend, Phelan Thaddeus, was 31. A former competitive powerlifter, he had followed Emmerich into mountaineering over the previous 2 years, joining him on several smaller climbs. He was also the person behind much of their content, helping film and document the Everest expedition. More than anyone, Phelan believed the summit could be a breakthrough moment for both of their careers. He was quieter than Emmerich, but just as confident, and often viewed warnings from others as a reflection of their own limits rather than the challenge itself. Neither man had been above 6,000 meters before this expedition, and to be fair, that's not as unusual as it sounds. Everest attracts people from all kinds of backgrounds, and plenty arrive with far more experience in other environments than they have at extreme altitude. Everest had been Emmerich's goal from the beginning, but Phelan played a major role in turning it into a reality. After Kilimanjaro, Emmerich began talking about Everest, first as a distant goal and then as a serious plan as his mountaineering content gained traction online. Phelan saw the potential immediately. Within a few months, they had signed on with a commercial expedition operator, secured a pair of sponsorships, and started building the story they would share with their audience from training to summit. The training over the next 18 months was serious. Altitude simulation mask, weighted hikes at elevation, cold exposure, VO2 max testing, structured training blocks. Emmerich shared nearly all of it online. The results were impressive, and by the time they left for Kathmandu in late March 2017, he was in the best shape of his life. Kathmandu was the first place the dynamic between the two men and the world around them became visible. They had arrived expecting a logistical hub, a place to sort gear, meet the expedition team, and move through efficiently. What they found was a city that operated entirely on its own terms, and neither of them adjusted to that easily. Phelan filmed constantly, the streets, the markets, the equipment shops, the other expedition members. He framed everything as backdrop, the city itself, the people in it, the culture around them. All of it appeared in the content as texture rather than substance. The pre-expedition briefing with the operator took place over 2 days and covered acclimatization protocols, emergency procedures, oxygen management, and the role of the Sherpa team. Emmerich listened and asked reasonable questions about the physical demands of each section. When the operator's representative explained the acclimatization rotation schedule, the series of up and down climbs between base camp and the higher camps that the body required before the summit push, Emmerich asked how much flexibility existed in the timeline. The representative said very little. Emmerich nodded and moved on, but Phelan noted the answer and filed it away as something to revisit later. The gear check flagged 2 items: lighter gloves than recommended and a sleeping bag rated to a temperature that was borderline for Camp 4 conditions. Emmerich said he ran warm and had tested the gloves in Colorado winters. The representative replaced the gloves without further discussion. It was a small moment, but it was the first of many where someone with more experience tried to make a correction and got pushback instead of acknowledgement. The trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp takes approximately 9 days and gains nearly 3,000 meters of elevation. It is not technically demanding, but it is the first real test of how a person responds to altitude, and it is where the Sherpa team begins forming their assessments of the clients they are going to take up the mountain. Their lead Sherpa, who had summited Everest 6 times and had been working with commercial clients for over a decade, met them at Lukla. He was quiet, precise, and had read both men within the first 2 days of walking. Emmerich was strong and moved well on the trail. Balin was also strong, but had a tendency to push the pace on uphill sections in a way that experienced high-altitude guides recognized immediately as the wrong instinct, burning energy to prove a point rather than conserving it for what was ahead. It's a pattern at this point. The fitter someone is, the harder it can be for them to accept that fitness isn't the currency that matters up here. The friction began around Dingbosch at approximately 4,400 meters, where the standard itinerary includes a rest day for acclimatization. Emmerich felt fine and said so. Phelan said the rest day felt unnecessary, given how well both of them were moving. Their lead Sherpa explained that feeling fine at 4,400 meters was not the relevant measure. The body's adaptation to altitude happened during rest, not during movement, and skipping rest days at this stage created deficits that compounded at higher elevations. Emmerich accepted this. Phelan filmed the explanation and posted it with a caption that was technically neutral, but carried a tone his audience understood. They reached Everest Base Camp at 5,364 meters on April 9th. Base Camp in the spring season is a small city of tents spread across the Khumbu Glacier. Dozens of expedition teams, hundreds of people, a constant low-level noise of wind and equipment, and conversation in multiple languages. For most climbers arriving for the first time, the scale of what they have committed to becomes suddenly and physically real when they can look up and see the mountain above them. Emmerich's response was to film it extensively and post a long video about the mental preparation required to stand at the bottom of Everest and commit to going up. It was one of his better pieces of content, honest about the weight of the moment, specific about the physical reality ahead. Phelan's response was more practical. He spent the first 2 days organizing camera equipment, testing battery performance in the cold, and working out the logistics of how they were going to document the climb. Their lead Sherpa conducted the first formal team briefing on their second day at base camp. He covered the rotation schedule, the oxygen system, the turnaround protocol, and the emergency procedures in detail. He was unhurried and specific. When he reached the section on turnaround time, 2 p.m. at the absolute latest on summit day, regardless of position on the mountain, Phelan asked whether that was a hard rule or an operator guideline. The Sherpa said it was a hard rule based on oxygen reserves, weather window timing, and the documented pattern of deaths on the mountain occurring overwhelmingly during descents that began too late. Phelan said he understood. He also established something at that briefing that both men heard but didn't fully absorb, that the Sherpa team were not support staff. They were the most experienced people on the mountain. They had been on this route more times than any client in the group, and their assessments of conditions and risk were not suggestions. The first acclimatization rotation took them from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at approximately 6,100 meters. The Icefall is a moving glacier riddled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers, navigated via aluminum ladders laid horizontally across gaps and fixed ropes running through the most dangerous sections. It requires crampons, precise footwork, and the ability to move efficiently while clipped to a rope with a heavy pack. At altitude, it is not the most technically demanding section of the climb, but it is the most objectively dangerous. Seracs and entire sections of ice can collapse without warning, and the route through it changes constantly as the glacier moves. Emmerich moved through it well. He was careful and methodical, and responded to the technical demands without the ego that sometimes caused stronger climbers to rush sections they should have taken slowly. Phelan struggled more than either of them had expected. The ladder crossings over the deeper crevasses required a specific kind of calm that his powerlifting background had not prepared him for. The exposure was different from anything he had trained for, and his pace through the icefall was noticeably slower than Emmerich's. He didn't say anything about it. Emmerich didn't either. Their lead Sherpa noted it and said nothing. The second rotation took them to Camp 2 at 6,400 meters, and then up toward Camp 3 at 7,200 meters. This was where the altitude began to separate the two men more clearly. Emmerich continued to perform within expected parameters, slower than at sea level. more effortful, but functional and controlled. Phelan developed a persistent headache above 7,000 meters, and his appetite dropped significantly. Both are recognized early symptoms of acute mountain sickness, and their lead Sherpa flagged them directly. He recommended that Phelan descend to Camp 2 for a rest day. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable, and Emmerich backed him up. The Sherpa made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign, not something to push through, but he wasn't going to force the decision. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next day, he took it as proof that the concern had been unnecessary. He recommended that Phelan descend from Camp 3 to Camp 2 for a rest day before continuing. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable and said he got headaches all the time at sea level. Emmerich agreed that he knew his own body. The Sherpa didn't force the issue, but he made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign that shouldn't be ignored. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next 24 hours, he took it as proof that the Sherpa had been overly cautious. What it actually meant was that his body was struggling to adapt to the altitude. Neither of them understood that at the time, and there was no way to make them. During that second rotation, a weather system moved in faster than forecast, and their lead Sherpa called a rest day at Camp 2. No movement toward Camp 3. Wait for conditions to stabilize. It was the correct call. The wind above Camp 2 was strong enough to make upward progress dangerous, and the energy cost of fighting it at that altitude had a recovery cost measured in days. Emmerich and Phelan were frustrated. They had been at Camp 2 for 2 days already, and the delay felt unnecessary from inside the tent, where the wind was audible but the sky above them looked manageable. Every day of delay was a day of content they weren't producing, and a day closer to the weather window closing. Phelan set up the camera. The video they recorded that afternoon was not a rant. It was calm, articulate, and framed as a candid update for their audience. Emmerich talked about the delay and suggested that some people on the mountain had spent so many years operating in a culture of caution that they struggled to recognize when conditions were actually acceptable. He said the Sherpas were incredibly valuable for logistics, route knowledge, and carrying loads. But that experience and expertise were not always the same thing. He argued that the people attempting the climb should ultimately be making the decisions, not the people hired to support it. He also said that he and his friend were capable of evaluating the conditions for themselves and didn't intend to hand over that responsibility to anyone else. Phelan added that the delay felt calibrated to the Sherpas' comfort level rather than the conditions themselves. He said there came a point where climbers had to trust their own assessment of the mountain. Instead of treating every recommendation as unquestionable, they brought the memory card down to base camp at the end of the rotation. Phelan edited the clip, compressed it, and uploaded it through the expedition's satellite terminal at base camp, the only place on the mountain with the bandwidth to support a video upload. It went live to their audience 3 days later. Their lead Sherpa saw the video on a phone that evening. Another member of the team had found it and shown it to him without comment. He watched it once, said nothing, and continued preparing the equipment for the next rotation. He did not raise it with either man directly, and I think that restraint, that choice to say nothing and just keep doing the job, says more about who he was than anything else in this story. After the rotations were complete, both men returned to base camp for a 4-day rest period before the summit push. On the third rest day, their lead Sherpa sat with both men for the summit briefing. He went through the plan in full: departure time from Camp 4, oxygen flow rates for each section, the turnaround rule, the signs of deterioration to watch for in each other, and the protocol if either of them became unable to move under their own power above Camp 4. He was specific and unhurried, and he did not soften any of it. He told them the weather window for their push was narrow. A system was forecast to arrive from the west within 36 to 40 hours of their planned departure from Camp 4. That meant the timing had almost no margin. They needed to move efficiently, they needed to respect the turnaround time, and they needed to be back at Camp 4 before the system arrived. Any significant delay at any point in the push compressed the margin further. He also told them that the headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation was something he had not forgotten, and that Phelan needed to be honest about how he was feeling at every stage of the push. If something felt wrong above 8,000 meters, the correct response was to say so immediately, not to manage it privately. The summit push was scheduled to begin from Camp 4 on the evening of May 17th. They left Camp 4, the South Col, at 7,950 meters at 10:30 p.m. on May 17th. The conditions at departure were within acceptable parameters. Cold, dark, wind at manageable levels, visibility adequate. Their lead Sherpa went first. A second Sherpa followed behind Phelan, who was the slower of the two. The section from Camp 4 to the balcony at approximately 8,400 meters took 4 hours and 30 minutes, longer than the standard 3 to 4 hours, primarily because of Phelan's pace. He was moving but not efficient. efficiently. His footwork was deliberate in a way that suggested he was working harder than the altitude alone accounted for. Their lead Sherpa slowed the group somewhat to match him, which compressed the timeline by approximately 45 minutes against the plan. At the balcony, the lead Sherpa checked both men's oxygen. Emmerich was on track. Phelan had consumed slightly more than projected due to the extended time on the lower section. The flow rate was adjusted marginally, and the deficit was noted. The margin was tighter than it should have been, and they hadn't even reached the hardest section yet. They continued upward. The section from the balcony to the south summit at 8,690 meters took another 5 hours and 40 minutes, far slower than expected. Phelan's pace had dropped noticeably, and his movements and responses were becoming less precise. He was still functioning, but something was clearly wrong. They reached the south summit at 9:20 a.m. on May 18th. Their lead Sherpa stopped the group and told them they needed to turn around. He explained the situation calmly. The summit was still at least 45 minutes away. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast, and Phelan had already used more oxygen than planned. Just as concerning was his condition. After hours in the death zone, he was showing signs that his body was no longer coping with the altitude the way it needed to. Emmerich said they were 45 minutes from the summit. He said they had been on the mountain for 6 weeks, had done everything correctly, and were standing at 8,690 meters. He said he was not turning around 45 minutes from the top. Their lead Sherpa said he was not, asking them to abandon the expedition. He was telling them that, continuing from this point, given Phelan's condition and the oxygen situation and the incoming weather, significantly reduced the probability of both of them getting back down. Phelan said he felt fine. His legs were heavy, but that was expected and he could manage it. Emmerich looked at him, then looked at the Sherpa and said they were continuing. Their lead Sherpa said he was formally advising against it and that he wanted that noted. Then he continued up the mountain with them because that was his job. It's hard not to respect people who do that for a living. Every trip up the mountain carries risks for them too, yet they keep going back to help other people reach the summit. They reached the summit at 10:50 a.m. Both men were exhausted in a way that was categorically different from any exhaustion either of them had experienced before. Not muscular, not cardiovascular, but a deep systemic depletion that made every movement require a separate, conscious decision. The wind had picked up noticeably in the last hour of the ascent. The sky to the west had changed. They had made it to the highest point on Earth. The descent began at 11:10 a.m. By the time they reached the section just below the summit, the wind had strengthened to the point where forward movement required active bracing. The incoming system was arriving ahead of schedule. Phelan's movement had become imprecise in a way that was no longer subtle. He was placing his feet on the fixed rope sections with a delay between intention and action that indicated his brain was not receiving adequate oxygen. On a ridge with significant exposure on both sides, that delay was dangerous in a specific and measurable way. Their lead Sherpa stayed within arm's reach of Phelan. The second Sherpa stayed close to Emmerich. The group was moving, but the pace was slower than the descent required, given what was building from the west. At approximately 1:20 p.m., at roughly 8,600 meters on the descent ridge below the south summit, Phelan stopped moving. He sat down on the ridge without warning, not a fall, just a cessation of forward movement. He said he needed a minute. His oxygen mask was still on, but his second bottle had been running longer than calculated due to the extended time above 8,000 meters, and the reserve was lower than it should have been. At that point in the descent, the lead Sherpa checked the gauge and switched him to the emergency bottle, the last one. He tried to get Phelan to stand. Phelan could not coordinate his legs well enough to stand safely on the ridge. His responses to instructions were present, but delayed by several seconds. His eyes were open, but not tracking normally. This was not exhaustion. This was high-altitude cerebral edema, the brain swelling that occurs when the body can no longer compensate for oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude, and it had been developing since at least the balcony, possibly earlier. The headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation had been the first signal. The slow pace, the imprecise footwork, the delayed responses on the ascent. All of it had been the progression of a process that Phelan's body had been fighting since before the summit push began. At 8,600 meters in a deteriorating storm, there was no treatment available and no way to descend fast enough to reverse it. Emmerich came back up to them. The wind was now strong enough that standing required active effort. The temperature had dropped sharply and visibility was beginning to close. The lead Sherpa told Emmerich directly that Phelan needed to be physically assisted down, and that doing so was going to require both Sherpas working together, which meant Emmerich needed to move independently for a section of the descent, staying on the fixed rope and moving as quickly as he could toward Camp 4. He made it approximately 200 meters further along the descent ridge before he also stopped. The hours above 8,000 meters, the oxygen depletion, the physical exertion of the ascent, and the beginning of the descent, and the cold had accumulated past the point his body could compensate for. He sat down on the ridge. He was conscious, more so than Phelan had been, but he could not stand. His hands were not responding with the precision required to manage the fixed rope safely. The lead Sherpa reached him after leaving Phelan with the second Sherpa. The wind was now at full storm intensity. Visibility had dropped to near zero. The temperature at that elevation with wind chill was approximately negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The lead Sherpa administered the last of the emergency oxygen supply to Emmerich. He stayed with him and attempted to get him moving for as long as conditions allowed. Emmerich was responsive to physical prompting, but could not sustain coordinated movement for more than a few steps before stopping again. Above them, the second Sherpa was in the same situation with Phelan, present, attempting to assist, unable to move a person who could not move themselves on a technical ridge in a whiteout storm at 8,600 meters. Radio contact with Camp 4 was established at approximately 2:15 p.m. A rescue from below was not possible. No one could ascend into those conditions to reach them. The team at Camp 4 could only maintain radio contact and wait. At some point in the following hours, radio contact with both men was lost. The lead Sherpa made it back to Camp 4 alone in the early hours of May 18th, severely depleted, with frostbite to 3 fingers on his left hand. The second Sherpa reached Camp 4 approximately 90 minutes later, also alone. When conditions allowed a search 2 days after the storm cleared, a team ascended the descent ridge from Camp 4. No trace of either man was found between the South Col and the South Summit. The search was called after 2 days without findings. The expedition operator's report documented the full timeline: departure from Camp 4, pace through each section, oxygen consumption rates, the turnaround recommendation at the South Summit, the decision to continue, and the lead Sherpa's account of the collapse and the conditions during the descent. A GPS device recovered from Camp 4 had logged the ascent track. The last recorded position was at approximately 8,590 meters at 1:47 p.m. on May 18th, consistent with the lead Sherpa's account of where Emmerich had stopped on the descent ridge. The coroner's determination, issued through the relevant Nepalese authorities, listed both Emmerich Pendleton and Phelan Thaddeus as presumed dead. Cause of death was listed as exposure and hypoxia, consistent with prolonged time in the death zone above 8,500 meters during deteriorating weather conditions. Contributing factors included oxygen reserves depleted beyond planned levels due to extended time above 8,000 meters, failure to initiate descent at the recommended turnaround point, and in Phelan Thaddeus's case, pre-existing signs of altitude-related cerebral stress that had been present since the second acclimatization rotation and had not been adequately addressed before the summit push. For a few minutes that morning, they stood on top of the world. In the end, neither Emmerich Pendleton nor Phelan Thaddeus was ever seen again.